Something just broke inside Washington. Donald Trump knows it. Republican senators are in open rebellion. The Senate is preparing a vote to strip Trump of his war powers. And for the first time, Trump is admitting he can't stop them. This isn't a political setback. This is a collapse of power in real time. From secret phone calls and private meltdowns to a bipartisan revolt that's cutting Trump out of his own party. Tonight, we expose what's happening behind closed doors, why Trump is panicking, and why this moment could permanently reshape American politics. Stay with me. What you're about to hear explains everything. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Donald Trump is losing control. And it's not Democrats doing it. It's Republicans. Senate Republicans are revolting. A war powers vote is closing in. Trump has privately admitted he can't stop it. Phones are ringing. Tempers are exploding. Power is slipping away faster than anyone expected. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on Trump's biggest fear, the Senate rebellion he never saw coming, and why this could mark the beginning of the end of his grip on the Republican Party. This isn't noise. This is history unfolding. Like this video if you want the truth behind Washington's power struggles. Share it so others see what the media won't explain clearly. Subscribe for unfiltered political analysis and breaking developments. This is George Will Unfiltered, and we're just getting started. Reporter ask Mr. President on NATO right now. It sounds like you're saying you would potentially acquire Greenland by force. That would be a NATO country. Are you saying that? Would you do that? Trump replied, "No, you're saying that. You're telling me that's what I'm going to do. You don't know what I'm going to do. Your network doesn't know either." Reporter again asked. The Danish foreign minister said there are still fundamental differences after the meeting with Rubio and the vice president. Are you willing to leave the NATO alliance to get what you want with Greenland? What are the options? Trump replies mockingly, "I'm not telling you what I'm willing to do. I'm not giving up options. But it's very important. Greenland is critical for national security, including Denmark's. The problem is that Denmark can't do a thing about it if Russia or China wants to occupy Greenland. But we can. You saw that last week with Venezuela. We cannot do anything about situations like that. It's not going to happen." Imagine this moment. A sitting president pacing behind closed doors, phone in hand, not calling allies, not rallying supporters, but frantically dialing Republican senators who are no longer picking up. For the first time in years, Donald Trump is publicly admitting something he rarely admits. He doesn't know how to stop them. That quiet confession is louder than any rally speech he's ever given. The Republican Senate is in open revolt, not against Democrats, not against the media, but against Trump himself. At the center, a war powers resolution threatening to do what Trump fears more than bad headlines. It would legally limit his ability to use military force as a personal political weapon. That's why the panic is real. That's why the pressure is relentless. And that's why this moment feels different, heavier, more dangerous for Trump than any scandal or indictment ever could. This isn't about optics. It's about control. Trump's entire political identity has been built on the illusion that he alone controls the room, the party, the narrative. Now that illusion is collapsing in real time as senators from his own party openly question not just his strategy, but his motives, his instincts, his judgment. The passage of this resolution, now appearing increasingly imminent, would represent a direct institutional rebuke of Trump's attempt to expand executive power through militarization, endless conflicts framed as security, vague threats dressed up as strength, and the constant suggestion that only he can keep America safe if given unchecked authority. Trump has always understood something clearly, even if he never says it. War, or the threat of war, concentrates power. It creates fear. It suppresses dissent. It rallies loyalty. And it allows a leader to blur the line between national interest and personal ambition. That's exactly why this vote has him spiraling. It doesn't just block one potential military action. It challenges the entire architecture of his authoritarian instinct. The idea that he can act first and justify later. That Congress will fall in line. That Republicans will always choose him over principle. That assumption finally breaks when figures like Rand Paul step forward. Not quietly, not cautiously, but publicly and unapologetically, calling out the absurdity of Trump's justifications for military escalation. When Rand Paul goes on Joe Rogan's platform and calmly walks listeners through the logic, or lack thereof, behind regime change arguments in Venezuela, he's doing something far more dangerous to Trump than opposition attacks ever could. He's showing Republicans it's possible to oppose Trump without immediately losing relevance, without being erased, without being destroyed. He does it by stripping the argument down to its core contradictions. Why does drug trafficking suddenly justify bombing another nation's capital? Why are indictments written in Washington treated as universal law? Why is possession of weapons by foreign leaders framed as criminal when the same logic would criminalize half of American gun owners? With each question, the Trump narrative loses another layer of credibility. It becomes clear this isn't about drugs. It isn't about cartels. It isn't even about Maduro. It's about pretext, finding any excuse necessary to justify force. Because force creates leverage. Leverage creates dominance. And dominance is the only political language Trump has ever truly spoken. That's why Paul's reminder that Trump himself pardoned a convicted drug trafficker hits so hard. It exposes the moral flexibility at the center of Trump's arguments. Laws matter when they're useful. Principles matter when they're convenient. National security matters only when it can be weaponized for personal gain. Paul. So let's be honest about the argument here. This isn't really about drugs, is it? It's about regime change. The claim is that the cartels are tied to Maduro. And that's the justification for blowing things up. Rogan. That's essentially the case they're making. Paul. But drugs aren't the real objective. Regime change is. Rogan. Then explain this. If it's regime change, why blow up a drug boat? Paul. Because they need a drug predicate. They need to say, this isn't war, even though it looks like war, even though it's treated like war. They want to take people the way you do in war, but without calling it a war. So they slap an arrest warrant on it, and that's how they convince otherwise principled people in my caucus to go along. People who would normally say, absolutely not. We don't bomb another country's capital and remove its leader. But then they add, oh, but he was indicted. Here's what most people don't know. Part of that indictment is for drugs. But think about this. How do we indict foreign leaders sitting in their own country for violating U.S. law when they haven't committed crimes on U.S. soil? And it doesn't stop there. Beyond drugs, They've indicted Maduro for possessing or conspiring to possess machine guns. That's the legal fiction. That's the workaround. That's how war gets rebranded as law enforcement. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's where the tension thickens. While cameras stay fixed on podium statements and clipped sound bites, the real drama is unfolding in quiet hallways, private offices, and late-night phone calls where Donald Trump's voice no longer carries the unquestioned authority it once did. Behind the scenes, Senate Republicans are doing something almost unthinkable in Trump-era politics. They're weighing their own political survival against his demands, and for the first time, many are choosing themselves. That shift is subtle but unmistakable, revealed not through dramatic press conferences, but through hesitation, through delayed statements, through carefully worded non-answers when reporters ask the simplest question, "How are you going to vote?" Hesitation is kryptonite to authoritarian power. Trump senses it. That's why his response has been escalation rather than persuasion, pressure rather than coalition building, intimidation rather than argument. He personally begins calling senators who supported moving the War Powers Resolution forward, not to debate the merits, not to offer policy justification, but to remind them who he believes still controls the party. Yet those calls land differently now. The senators on the other end are no longer junior backbenchers terrified of primary challenges. They're lawmakers staring down brutal midterm math, shrinking margins, and polling data that tells a clear story. Trump's endorsement doesn't guarantee safety anymore. In some cases, it's becoming a liability. This reality is driving the quiet rebellion we're witnessing, because what looks like a procedural fight over a single resolution is actually a referendum on Trump's grip over the Republican Senate. Senate leadership knows it. That's why they scramble for procedural maneuvers, technical delays, parliamentary tricks. Not out of confidence, but out of fear of what a public defeat would symbolize. A War Powers Resolution passing despite Trump's opposition would mark one of the clearest institutional repudiations of his authority to date, a moment where Congress reasserts itself after years of surrendering power to the executive branch. Trump understands that symbolism all too well. His political rise has always depended on the perception that institutions bend for him, that rules become flexible around him, that resistance is futile. You can see it in the way senators like Josh Hawley and Todd Young suddenly become central figures, not because of what they say, but because of what they refuse to say. Declining to publicly commit, leaving Trump in limbo, forcing him to wait, to wonder, to guess. That uncertainty is poison for a man who thrives on dominance. Uncertainty means he no longer controls the outcome, and control has always been his currency. As this unfolds, it exposes a deeper truth about Trump's relationship with power. He doesn't build coalitions. He enforces loyalty. And loyalty enforced through fear only lasts as long as fear outweighs self-interest. Right now, self-interest is winning. Republicans are watching Trump rack up loss after loss, watching bipartisan coalitions override his priorities, watching Congress reverse his budget cuts, restore funding to science and research, and openly defy his attempts to hollow out institutions he views as inconvenient. Each defeat chips away at the myth of Trump as an unstoppable force, replacing it with a far more dangerous image for him. Trump as a declining asset, a leader whose threats no longer guarantee results. That image terrifies him because it invites calculation. Calculation leads to defection. Defection leads to collapse. Nowhere is that more evident than in the way Republicans are now openly discussing ideology without centering on Trump. For years, MAGA wasn't an ideology so much as a personality cult, a movement defined by loyalty to one man rather than a coherent set of principles. But now cracks are forming as lawmakers revisit questions Trump once buried under slogans. Should America be involved in endless wars? Should presidents have unilateral authority to deploy force? Should foreign policy be driven by spectacle rather than strategy? These questions matter precisely because they can't be answered by Trump's usual instincts. Trump doesn't believe in restraint. He believes in leverage. He doesn't believe in strategy. He believes in dominance. When Republicans start debating interventionism versus isolationism, congressional authority versus executive power, they're implicitly sidelining Trump, because he has nothing to contribute beyond threats and theatrics. That sidelining is existential for him. Trump without the spotlight is Trump without power. This ideological shift is being accelerated by electoral reality. Senate Republicans know the math is brutal. Their margins are thin. The House is already teetering. Midterms are coming like a freight train. In that environment, blind loyalty becomes a luxury they can't afford. Trump's insistence on framing every disagreement as a betrayal only accelerates the process. It leaves no room for nuance, no space for dissent, no path for reconciliation, forcing lawmakers to choose between submission and independence. Increasingly, they're choosing independence, even if they don't say it out loud yet. This did not get enough attention. Did you see this? Headline: Congress is rejecting Trump's steep budget cuts to science. Congress is racing to undo thousands of cuts to federal science programs that President Trump called for last year. Trump tried to cut the National Science Foundation 56%. Congress is now saying they'll cut it by less than 1%. Trump wanted to slash NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You know, the weather. Congress's budget for NOAA? No cuts. Flat funding. Trump wants to cut basic research, which has been the lifeblood of American technological innovation since World War I, by more than 33%. Congress instead is bumping up the budget for basic research by more than 2%. Trump is demanding all these cuts to science. Congress is saying no. And this is bipartisan. This started in the Senate as a bipartisan agreement. Last week, the House voted for it as well. I know it's muscle memory to assume Congress does nothing. And if they ever defy that rule and do something, it's always something bad. Trump has always relied on attention as a substitute for legitimacy. When attention turns from awe to analysis, from spectacle to scrutiny, his power diminishes. This loss of narrative control pushes Trump deeper into distraction politics, provocative foreign policy rhetoric, exaggerated security threats, vague insinuations of decisive action, not because they're effective policies, but because they generate noise. And noise has always been Trump's shield against accountability. Yet even that shield is cracking. Lawmakers, voters, and commentators are beginning to separate noise from consequence. That separation is fatal for a political figure whose brand depends on conflating the two. The psychological fracture within MAGA becomes impossible to ignore. The movement that once revolved entirely around Trump's personality is now facing internal contradictions it can no longer suppress. Contradictions between isolationism and interventionism, between anti-establishment rhetoric and authoritarian impulse. Between populist messaging and elite-serving outcomes, Trump has no answer to these contradictions because he never built MAGA to resolve them. He built it to serve himself. Now that the movement is being forced to confront real policy questions, Trump becomes an obstacle rather than a guide, a liability rather than a leader. This is where figures like Thomas Massey's call to consider life without Donald Trump land with such force. They articulate what many Republicans are thinking, but haven't yet said out loud. That Trump's presence is no longer synonymous with victory. That his dominance no longer guarantees unity. That clinging to him indefinitely may be the fastest path to irrelevance. For Trump, this realization is catastrophic. His power has never come from ideology, organization, or institutional control. It has come from the belief that he is inevitable, that he is unavoidable. Once that belief fades, once Republicans start planning for a post-Trump future, his leverage evaporates. And this is why the war powers revolt. The budget defeats, the bipartisan votes, and the ideological fights all converge into one devastating truth. Donald Trump is no longer shaping events. He's being shaped by them, reacting instead of directing, scrambling instead of commanding. That reversal marks the real turning point, because strong men don't fall when they lose elections. They fall when their supporters stop believing in their strength. And that belief is eroding in real time. Vote by vote. Decision by decision. What remains isn't the towering figure Trump once projected, but a politician boxed in by institutions he tried to dominate, by allies who no longer fear him, and by a party quietly beginning to imagine a future without him at the center of everything. The spell is breaking. And once it breaks, it never fully returns. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening in Washington, like this video. Share it so others can see past the noise. And subscribe to George Will. Unfiltered for clear, uncompromising political insight. This story isn't over. But the power shift has already begun.